You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by André Côté, the Interim Executive Director of the Dais, a public policy and leadership think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking a lot about the digital world in Canada, which is becoming increasingly relevant to people, obviously, as we talk about AI, as we talk about, working online, as we talk about the technologies the next generation are going to inherit in the workplace. So who better to come to than you, Andre, and sort of the team at the Dais, which is at Toronto Metropolitan University. You guys, sort of live and breathe this space all day long. Before we really start, I want to give our listeners a chance to understand the kind of work you do. Can you explain a little bit about your think tank and, the work that you do day to day?
Yeah, for sure. So as you say, we are a think tank and leadership institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. And so thematically, the kind of the three areas that we're focused in are innovation and tech policy, education and skills, and democracy. And so a lot of the work that we do, including the survey of online harms and some of the other things we'll talk about, the sweet spot's kind of at the intersection of those three areas of tech, education, and democracy. And then in terms of the, call it programmatically what we do this kind of, the traditional think tanky policy research, putting out reports. We have a team that does economics work, which I think is really important. So we're able to do good quantitative work, but also qualitative work as well. That's we put out reports, submissions to government, shorter kind of briefs and commentary pieces, the think tanky stuff. But then we also have a Dais learning arm. So we offer numerous programs geared to kind of upskilling professionals, mostly around tech and tech policy related issues, but also some fellowship programs and some other things. And then our third sort of program pillar is like our events and kind of convening activities. And so it ranges from, we co-produce, I think it's Canada's largest democracy conference with OCAD University and some other partners, down to, we do a lot of like small, policy focused roundtable discussions. So it'll be, 20 people engaging on a specific issue like, AI adoption in the economy. And then a variety of things in between, public speaker series, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I was going to say, because you guys have not existed for that long, and I feel like you're punching well above your weight in terms of think tanks, because, there's some of the older generation ones that have been around for quite a while, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's under 10 years you guys have existed at this point.
Well, so the Dais in its kind of present form has only actually been around 2 years. But we had a bit of a head start because there were two think tanks at TMU that existed previously. One of them was called the Leadership Lab, the other one, the Brookfield Institute. And so a couple of years back, there was a merger of the two. We Voltron together into what we, kind of relaunched as the Dais. And so those two centers went back to, I think they pretty much both started around 2015. So there's, pretty much a decade of track record, dating back through those two think tanks, and then they came together more recently as the Dais.
You guys, you mentioned some of the things you do. You do conferences, you do speaker series. You do a lot of work with journalists, actually, to highlight different speakers as well. Like, you guys have a ton of programming, and all of it is good. It comes to the point where it's hard to go to all of it because there's just too much good stuff and only so little time. But one of the things that you do every year is the survey of online harms. And I think you've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years now. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, maybe how that report came together in the first place, and then sort of what you track year over year in that document?
Sure. So yeah, I think this edition that we just put out, the 2025, was the 6th edition, and we kicked it off back in 2018. So it is the longest standing, kind of longitudinal survey of its kind in Canada. And if you think back to 2018, in the history of call it the history of tech, or kind of our digital age, there was sort of this moment, in the early 2000s, where we started to see the emergence of social media platforms. In the later 2000s, we had the launch of, we had the BlackBerry, of course, which we Canadians loved, but then there was the launch of the iPhone, and you started seeing these social platforms really rising into, kind of to the scale that they've begun to reach today. But there was more so, kind of a positivity around them. Like if you go back to the Arab Spring period in the early 2010s, a sense that they're creating this sort of digital public sphere, this digital public space. It was mostly positive. It was a place where people would come together. And then you fast forward to the later 2010s, and post the Cambridge Analytica, the Snowden, the tide had kind of turned a little bit, or things had sort of shifted to sort of a darker place in terms of the broader public perception of tech and these social platforms. Some called it like the tech lash in that sort of 2016 to 18, 19 period. And so it was right around this time where we kicked off the first of these surveys to look at how are Canadians experiencing these social media platforms, and what types of harms are they encountering on those platforms. And so that was kind of the basis of it. And then over time, we've stuck to a lot of the kind of core pieces, which I can get into. And then we sort of branched off, as the world and the digital landscape has evolved, to start to get into other emerging things like, like crypto, or, now obviously there's a big focus on AI and deepfakes. So it's evolved a little bit, but we've kind of stuck to a lot of this sort of core questions to make sure that it gives us this kind of longitudinal picture going back to 2018.
Right. So what are some of those, core pieces that you cover each year, and like what was kind of remarkable about this year compared to past data, if anything?
Well, so the first piece is we want to know, how are Canadians using social media platforms? And so the survey is a nationally representative survey of Canadians 16 plus. So we're surveying all across the country, and including youth, but from that 16 year plus sort of age group. And so the first thing we ask is, what social media platforms are you using, and how often are you using them? And so the trends, there weren't any kind of earth-shattering changes this year. But we've seen kind of a gradual uptick over the years in terms of social platform usage, and some changes across which platforms people are using. But I mean, the Coles Notes for me is, social media use is, you could say, pretty much ubiquitous across Canadians. The very top used platforms, like Facebook and YouTube, they continue to be, at the top of the list. Are used at least once annually by, the vast majority of Canadians, and then usage will be way higher among certain types of groups. Younger people are obviously, much like, as you work down through age demographics, like younger demographics are larger users, and they're also using a much broader suite of platforms. So obviously, like a bunch of growth on TikTok, but also continue to use Snapchat, et cetera, et cetera. One new thing we added this year was, it's not quite a social platform, although they're sort of heading in those directions, but we asked about use of ChatGPT, just to sort of benchmark it against use of more traditional social media platforms. And it remained reasonably low when we surveyed earlier this year, although it was rising quickly. But so I think the key kind of finding there is social platform use is relatively ubiquitous amongst Canadians. And then we start to get into a bunch of other questions. Where are Canadians getting their news from, and to what extent is that from social platforms or from other news sources? The kind of Coles Notes finding there is Canadians still rely on other news sources like news websites and like television news, for example, but it skews much more to older Canadians who are using those sources, whereas younger age groups much more reliant on social media platforms. This is an alarming trend these days because one thing that's happened in the last couple of years is the federal government passed this online news act legislation, which prompted Meta to basically pull news content off of their platforms. So one of the findings this year was a quarter of Canadians report using social platforms or report using Facebook as a news source when there is no, what you'd call
there's no news,
mainstream news on Facebook. So I mean, I think, and that's obviously concentrated more amongst younger Canadians as well. So I mean, I think there's some alarming trends there in terms of where people are getting their news from. And anyways, I can elaborate more.
Yeah. Have you found since that, since the legislation came in from the federal government, and again, as you mentioned, like this is a response from platforms to that legislation. News was not banned from these platforms. It was voluntarily taken off by these platforms in response to legislation they did not like. But have you seen a shift in the data over that time of people increasingly seeking out news on those platforms, despite the lack of the news there?
How exactly things unfolded post the legislation and Meta pulling news is still something that's being looked at. But like our colleagues at McGill have done some really interesting work to look at it, to look at the impacts. And so on the one hand, you had things where users there were kind of like some hacks. So like users would start to screen cap news articles, or at least like headlines that they wanted to, and so they could post those. So even if they couldn't post the link, they'd find kind of alternative ways to post to post news that they could share off with their communities. The influencer piece is really interesting. And actually our colleagues at McGill, I know, are about to put something out on that front. I think the broad trend has been there is a really significant shift towards people accessing, call it quote unquote news through influencers. And of course, the big problem there is influencers are not bringing any type of journalistic standard that can ensure the integrity of the information that they're sharing. And often they'll be paid, they'll have an agenda. And so it's not to necessarily, besmirch all the influencers out there, but it's just to say, if what we're seeking are reliable sources of information to inform our citizenry, whether about politics or their democracy or vaccine awareness or all these types of things, these are trends we should be paying very close attention to and probably be a little bit concerned about.
Definitely. And I think that sort of leads into my next question. So, the 2025 report, one of the things that it showed is that young people in Canada are experiencing a lot more misinformation, hate, identity-based abuse than other groups in Canada. And you just mentioned, as we normally look to journalists for accurate news to help, form our opinions on democracy and our citizenship and the things we're going to do there. How do you think this is influencing the next generation's view of these things? Because they're really not getting their news from the same sources as before, and this rise of the newsfluencer, I think they're calling them.
Yeah.
It really can throttle the perspectives of an entire generation on what's going on in their country.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what to tell you. I think it's concerning. I think it's very concerning. I mean, so firstly, they are more prominent users of these platforms, as you noted. they are more likely to experience a variety of those different types of harms. As more prominent users of those platforms, they, one sort of category of, call it harmful information that they're more exposed to would be like, mis and disinformation on those types of platforms. But also, just coming back to that point around, the sort of integrity of the news, the public affairs, like other types of information, public health information that people are receiving. If social media platforms are your main source, if the biggest of those platforms are cutting off access to real news content, and so what you're exposed to is the rest, is this an information environment that's going to allow people, to thrive as citizens in our society going forward? So I think that's something we have to be quite concerned about, and I know that'll kind of lead into some of the actions that we'll talk about later. The one thing I would add is, like, if I were to sort of summarize the whole report into a few kind of bullet points, it would be one, Canadians are using these platforms at extremely high rates. So it's almost kind of like ubiquitous use of these platforms. When you ask them about their trust in these platforms to be acting in the public interest, it's incredibly low. They're the least trusted companies amongst a long list that we asked them about. And the social platforms in particular, like Facebook or TikTok or X, way less trust than, for example, some American big tech companies. Like if you just ask directly about Google, Google's sort of middle of the pack, including Canadian companies, whereas the social platforms, very low trust. Again, Canadians continue to recognize that they're experiencing these harms on the platforms. And the concluding part of the study starts to get into, okay, well, so what do we do about it? And Canadians pretty overwhelmingly want government to intervene, to regulate, to put requirements on these platforms, to offer greater protections for users, even where you give them a bit of a, the sort of conflicting side. So we'll ask them, would you prefer the government regulate, even if it might have the effect of limiting your free speech in certain areas, for example? And 2/3 of respondents say, yes, go for it. And when you ask them about very specific policy recommendations, we give a long list. They are even more supportive, with at the very top of the list some of the interventions to protect children and youth, including placing requirements on platforms to be removing child sexual abuse material, and a variety of the aspects like that. So Canadians are heavy users of the platforms. They do not trust the platforms, and they want government to step in to create safer spaces on the platforms.
It is a really interesting dichotomy there of we can't seem to get off these platforms. We're, as you know, in terms of countries, one of the most heaviest users of social media anywhere in the world. And to your point, we don't trust the platforms, although it is a bit generational, though, because younger people really don't trust the platforms. Older people have a bit more trust in them. But you did mention, you were just mentioning, non-consensual image sharing, things like that. We usually talk about, when we talk about online harms, we almost only talk about disinformation, and it's not like there isn't a ton of that. So like just today I was looking on Twitter, and this woman was talking about how the federal government has put no funding into wildfire prevention, and it's just strictly not true. And she shared an image from somewhere from the budget, supposedly. And I went and looked at the budget. I'm like, well, that's not accurate. Here's the funding that they listed here. So it's everywhere, and we see it constantly. But that's not the only harm. There are a lot of other harms that maybe people aren't aware of. And when I talk about digital stuff, I'm always thinking of parents, because one of the stats that I've seen recently is that if you create a social media account for a young boy, maybe like 12 or something like that, within 2 minutes, I think it was within 2 minutes, he'll immediately start getting inundated with misogynistic content from basically, the manosphere. And that's how the algorithms work right now, and there are a lot of different ways that harm comes. It's not just in disinformation. There's a lot of other content there. Can you talk about some of that? Like there's deep fakes, which I've been very concerned about from a political standpoint. Like that's going to cause problems in the future. There's the image sharing piece, which, you know, I think with young people as well, there's a lot of harms that are inflicted that way. What are some of the other issues that people should be on the lookout for when they're online?
Sure. I mean, you know, the funny part with the mis and disinformation piece is there's a lot of concern about it. There's been a lot of discussion of it. Um, the government last year tabled a bill to, you know, seek to regulate the platforms in these ways, you know, for online safety. It did not include mis and disinformation in the scope of the bill, in large part because it's like particularly challenging to get at as like a category of content. And so it's interesting that way. There has been a lot of focus on it, but it wasn't even covered in this proposed legislation that didn't pass last year, but, you know, that's still being discussed. Some of the other major categories of content, certainly some aspects focused on children and youth. So sharing of, you know, non-consensual sexual images is certainly a category. And so there are a few others related to children and youth. But I mean, you know, other prominent categories that get a lot of focus, hate speech on platforms, incitement to violence on platforms. That's one of the major sort of content categories that would have been covered by the bill. Terrorist related content. So there are a number of other categories like that are typically looked at, and that I think we asked about in this survey as well. And I think, you know, some of the other ones that maybe receive less attention than they should, given the scale of the problem, online financial scams and frauds are a massive issue. And I think, I don't have like good data on this, but I think it has become a particular issue for younger Canadians as well. Because again, they're more on the platforms, but B, because, you know, they've been more curious around things like crypto, for example, where like crypto has been like a huge vector for, we put out a whole report about this a couple of years ago, for all manner of financial scams, frauds. So I think there's that category. I think for kids, you know, one area that has received probably way too little attention is around video gaming. It's like a ginormous industry. It is, you know, a huge vector for children's attention and activity, and it's a place that we've spent very little time sort of looking at what's going on there. And I think, and it's not to say it's all bad. It's just to say it's another area of our, you know, sort of online universe that we need to think about. And I think obviously, you know, the other one that's been coming at us quickly is artificial intelligence, and all these new, you know, large language model chatbots at scale, you could say. And, you know, you hear weekly alarming stories, for example, around, you know, just the humanistic aspects of some of these chatbot tools, and the extent to which, for youth especially, but not exclusively for youth, how they can build these kind of emotional bonds with these systems, and it can lead them to very dark places. And you know, people have been doing testing around, if you prompt them in certain ways, like will they give you advice on self-harm, on suicide, on all these types of things. So there's a whole new sort of category of risks, I think, that we'll need to better understand around those emerging AI tools.
One of the responses to the fact that there are all these harms out there is a bit of a call for digital abstinence. So there's a very viral book out there called The Anxious Generation, and it's by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. I followed his work for a while now because of some courses I took previous where he had come up before he had written this book. So I knew of him beforehand. And essentially he argues that, smartphones and social media platforms are spiking mental illness in kids, and that parents should maybe consider imposing, a policy of digital abstinence up to the age of 16 or so. Now, Haidt has been accused by not just small organizations, but like a plethora of organizations like Nature and really prominent organizations about using really incomplete data and drawing unfounded conclusions for this book, and that he's essentially scaremongering and that the data do not support his findings. However, despite that, as we know, virality often moves faster than fact. And, he's been on Michelle Obama's podcast and stuff to talk about this book. So this argument is everywhere. But when I think about it, I think about to me, these issues are very similar to sex ed, that if you preach just pure abstinence, then your kids don't know what they're dealing with when they actually get to the age where they are dealing with these things. And it's my opinion that it's probably better to teach kids how to use digital tools and how to spot harms as they're growing up with this technology, rather than, dumping them into it when they're 16. Now, that's just me having an opinion. You're the one who actually studies this. Do they have an argument? Is there a better argument for maybe training kids on how to navigate this world?
Well, so that's funny. That's funny framing. It kind of reminds me of, you'd hear the stories about students at McGill in Montreal, or at the universities in Montreal, and there'd be the American students would come, and they have the 21 drinking limit, and so when they'd show up at 17 in Montreal, they would go absolutely sort of crazy at the pubs, whereas the Canadian kids had been at it a little bit longer. So does it?
Yeah, I was at U of O across the river from Gatineau, of course, so similar experience there.
Yeah. But okay, I mean, here. So firstly, yes, of course, very familiar with Jonathan Haidt. Have read The Anxious Generation, some of his earlier books. So, I mean, I understand the critiques around the social science. I think also he published this book as like a mainstream bestseller type. And
sure,
so
like pulp science.
Yeah, I mean, he's not putting it out as an academic journal here. And so, so he is an academic. Should he have a certain obligation to rigor? Of course. And in reading the book, you do note that there's maybe a little bit of correlation confusion with causation in some instances. But I would say a couple things. I think one, in an area like this, what should be our burden of evidence for deciding we need to do something about it, right? Do we need perfect evidence that there is a massive sort of causal relationship between these devices and what's on them, in particular social media, with taking action to protect our kids, right? What is the burden of evidence? And I feel like a lot of the people on the other side of the argument are setting this expectation of this sort of impenetrable burden of evidence before taking action, that I think in the real world is not reasonable at all. And as you would know, being a public policy hack like me, there are many other domains of policymaking where you're operating with imperfect information, but on the basis of what evidence you have, plus a lot of sort of, anecdotal or sort of, public engagement, you get a sense of this is a place where you need to do something. So that would be point one. What is the burden of evidence we're expecting to be able to move on this? The second would be, I have huge respect for him for surfacing this issue and building movements around it in quite constructive ways, mostly. And so we're doing a lot of work on kids and tech stuff. We're running a national project that's focused on school phone restrictions, and we're in very close touch with folks south of the border who are kind of part of his communities, like through the American Phone Free Schools movements and others. It's like, do we agree with them on every last thing? And do we think that sometimes that their policies and approaches, some adapted from him, are like maybe a little bit too absolutist in some points? Perhaps. And in our system in Canada with our jurisdictions, like provinces are going to kind of go in their separate directions. But I mean, do I believe that all of this is kind of like rowing in the right direction? Like, absolutely. We need to take action to ensure that there is a healthy relationship between our children and youth and their technologies in their lives and in their schools. And so that would be my take on Height. I think he's, while you can question some of his evidence, I think he's done a large public service in terms of advancing this issue.
I think the main thing would be, being a good reminder to parents to follow up on what their kids are doing with their tech, right? Like it's essentially a call to be an involved parent. I don't know how much you have to restrict kids, but I think, earlier I was talking about that 2-minute window before young boys start to be bombarded with like really misogynistic content. And I think that's a concern that I have for people I know who are parents, is that the sense I get is people think if I just am a good parent, I can raise my kid up right. And they're not necessarily accounting for just how much other messaging is coming at their kid and from where. And I don't know necessarily that surveillance of your kids is the other solution to it, because at the end of the day, they're going to be at a friend's house. They're going to, there's always other things. The best thing that I think parents can do in this space, rather than banning their kids from tech for a certain age or trying to surveil them all the time, is teaching them the right tools for navigating this information, and also figuring out ways to spot information that doesn't feel quite right. So this is one of the things that they're doing in Finland, and this has been one of the big stories in recent tech news, I think, over the last couple of years. Is I'm very interested in the concept of pre-bunking, which is where you show people how to identify disinformation in the first place, so they are functionally inoculated against it when it shows up, because it will show up. And they have found, people who are in cult deprogramming is really, really hard work. And if you can just protect people from that kind of content in the first place, it is much easier to, prevent them from falling into it or pulling them out afterwards. So, in Finland, it's one of the most media literate countries in the world. They've put media literacy into, their national education systems, in their curriculum. They provide digital education courses for the elderly, which is like a really important side of this if you're trying to avoid old people getting scammed and things like that. They even have a fact-checking agencies to support their citizens in finding this information. And this isn't just them responding to the internet. They also share a border with Russia. And, from a political democratic standpoint, this is fundamental to protecting their society and their way of life. So, I've seen some studies that have said that in Finland, kids younger than 6 years old already know how to spot disinformation. And that is wild to me. So to me, this is the flip side of the argument about digital abstinence, is like, actually teach your kids how to use these tools to figure out what information is coming at them that's good or bad, false or accurate, that kind of thing. Can you talk about that sort of example and what we can learn from that in Canada?
I think, firstly, I would say, just to come back to the digital abstinence point, like, we've been looking at the research, looking at the evidence. We've been doing our own polling. We've been fanning out across the country to talk to educators about these issues, as well as to parents. And there are these like emerging parents advocacy movements around these things, many of which are supporting the those types of abstinence approaches. I mean, a key point I would make is, you know, parents are first and foremost concerned about the safety and well-being of their kids. Like that is, and they are just feeling like they don't know what to do, right? They're feeling as though their kids are not safe on these platforms, or are faced with a lot of this type of, you know, bad content, and so in the absence of, you know, governments or platforms addressing the issue, I think they're kind of seeking some reasonably blunt solutions, which is like, okay, we'll just keep the phone out of the hands. And I have a lot of sort of sympathy for that position. At the same time, you know, the flip side is, in our digital society, we need to be equipping digitally literate, digitally capable citizens from early in their lives. And so I think that's what we're really grappling with right now is, the abstinence piece is coming from like a really good place. But the challenge is, it can potentially be at the expense of, trying to equip, you know, children, youth in those ways. So I think that there's a real tension there. And I think that, you know, listen, Finland is a really interesting case. It maybe helps that you have, you know, this big adversary right in your border that you, are constantly concerned about. And, you know, another example we look closely at, you know, we had the digital minister from Taiwan here, last year. She talked a lot about
Right. Yeah.
pre-bunking,
Incredible.
but it's like, it's not, you know, it's not like an academic exercise for them. Like, it was essential to ensuring the integrity of their election because they're constantly being bombarded with subterfuge, false information from China, basically, right? So it's one thing where you're kind of on the front lines of these things. But I mean, you know, what I would say about Finland is they have taken a much more comprehensive approach to digital connectivity across their society, including digital literacy, including thinking about, digital access and connectivity as it relates to public services, industry. And so I think, you know, here in Canada, we have not taken that kind of comprehensive approach. We've been heavily focused on the access piece, and the way our governments have moved on that is through, you know, like broadband investment policies, but it's not it's making sure people are able to buy access, wherever they are, but it does not touch on the various other components. So it's not an integrated approach. And then I think as it relates specifically to digital literacy, I mean, there are efforts. There are many good groups, out there doing it. We've done a little bit of that work. I think it's certainly apparent that, like in our provincial K-12 systems, we've been slow to move in terms of embedding, digital literacy as like core components of the curriculum from an early age. And I also agree that, you know, critical to work with other population groups, like with seniors. I look at my, hopefully my parents won't listen to this, but I look at my dad and his use of his tablet, and it's you know, it's been funny juxtaposing our work on kids in tech with my observing his use, because they're all the same parallels. You know, one of the interesting aspects with kids' use of tech is it can bridge to mental health issues. And actually, I was on a call earlier with someone from Sick Kids who, you know, they're like very focused on these issues. But there's some other academics in Canada who are looking at the actual physical health impacts, including increased sedentary behavior because kids are in front of screens so often. Well, for senior populations, it's exactly the same. And the outcome is maybe worse because they're at an age where, you know, reduced physical mobility means that they might not get it back after. So it's interestingly like a lot of the same issues, but just at a different life stage.
it's like earlier when you brought up that young people are actually like a big target for scams now, because I think most people think, older, like senior citizens are who people, the like Nigerian prince stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
those old email chains and stuff. Like the modern version of that does go after, like it doesn't matter if you're old or young. We have a lot of similar experiences here. So, we were just talking about how as governments across the country, we haven't really done enough work in this space to I think all the time about like every election cycle for like 15 years there's been promises of like northern broadband and things like that, and we just keep promising the same things and not really delivering them. But to your point, there's no broader strategy beyond that when it comes to digital until now, really. So Prime Minister Mark Carney, of course, is the new prime minister. He appointed Evan Solomon as Canada's first minister for artificial intelligence and digital innovation. So, and you have some background in this sort of type of file because, of course, when we worked together in government, you did a lot of work on the digital innovation space. And I can't even imagine what the pace of that is like in government now, because, of course, that was, 10 years ago. So Solomon, in his sort of initial pitching of what his office is going to be like to the media, he essentially said that, it's dedicated to supporting the growth of AI in Canada and creating a sovereign AI strategy. So some might see that at odds with what you were mentioning earlier, where a lot of people in Canada really want tighter regulations on digital platforms and things like ChatGPT in these sort of digital spaces to protect young people, but also all of us in our democracy. How can Canada become a leader in this space while still protecting, our citizens and our democratic processes?
On the one hand, it's a very good thing that we have Minister Solomon in this portfolio, that there's much more of kind of a spotlight on, prime ministers, premiers. They put out their mandate letters and their platforms, their mandate letters, their throne speeches, but also like the choice of their cabinet and the way they title the position sends pretty clear signals about, what they're prioritizing. So I think in those respects, it's good. I think it comes at a moment where, and it's driven heavily by the Trump administration, what's happening south of the border, but there's been this real big pullback on the focus on trust and safety in social media and in tech more generally. In the AI space, there was this big AI summit in France earlier this year, and these summits have typically been focused on advancing AI technology, but also with a big focus on the safety components. A lot of that has been really deprioritized in favor of this focus on really accelerating innovation in AI and accelerating adoption of AI broadly across industry, across society. So it's really this like, okay, let's plow ahead and let's maybe park some of the conversations about safety, about regulation, because it's going to get in the way of innovation adoption and set us behind in this global, framed as this global race against adversaries like China, et cetera, et cetera. So we're kind of in that moment. I feel like the government is responding a little bit to that circumstance. I think they're also saying, there is significant potential for AI to support this kind of renewed economic agenda that they're big on pushing. And Prime Minister Carney has also signaled that, as we shift spending into defense and generally try and tighten belts fiscally, that AI is going to be relied upon to kind of drive efficiencies in government as well. And so we'll sort of see how all that plays out. I just think my view, and I think where we continue to come from at the Dais, is that you can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. You can pursue an AI and a digital technology agenda that is about supporting the growth of the digital economy, supporting the adoption of these technologies across not just the economy, but across our society, for the use of citizens. We're just launching a program in AI adoption in the nonprofit sector, responsible AI adoption. major opportunities there in sectors like that are kind of under-resourced. You can do all those things while also regulating the development and deployment and use of these technologies to ensure public and consumer safety and achieve other types of objectives. And so I think we should continue to be seeking to pursue both. I think that in terms of what they've signaled, I would certainly say that for us and many other groups that we're talking to who've done a lot of work on the online harms, online safety stuff, we are a little bit concerned that there was a bill last year that, wasn't perfect, but it was, it would have been better than the nothing that we have presently. And when that failed with prorogation earlier in the year, there was a real need to kind of bring something back in this space. And there is a real concern that could be deprioritized as we head into into this next legislative session. And so I know there'll be many groups kind of advocating for that. And I would say on the regulatory side, Canada's privacy legislation, the PIPEDA legislation, for example, is decades old. It's antiquated legislation. It was developed before, this kind of internet age, basically. That type of legislation is like critical framework legislation that can actually be quite supportive of the growth of your digital economy, your innovation economy, but by putting the right frameworks in place, the right sort of guardrails, creating some sort of certainty for industry. A really key one is it has to allow for some interoperability with other jurisdictions, where like our businesses will be trading, for example. And so advancing things like updated privacy legislation can have the effect of both protecting Canadians and their data, and also serving to put some important sort of legal infrastructure in place to support economic growth. So this is where we're coming from. You need growth and guardrails, and I think we Canadians are smart enough to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time to do both.
Growth and guardrails. I think that's perfect. Thanks for joining me so much today. I think people are going to learn a lot from this episode, and I highly recommend that people continue to go follow the work you guys are doing at your organization, because I think it will help people navigate this period.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.